Welcome to Grumpy Strategists, the Budget Edition. I'm Michael Shoebridge from Strategic Analysis Australia, and I'm here with the Head of Research at SAA, Dr. Marcus Hellyer. Marcus, you might tell everyone where we're recording this from.
Well, we're actually deep within the bowels of Parliament House this time. We're actually in Treasurer Jim Chalmers' office reviewing some of the documentation. We are right at the heart of the system here. So we're mainlining access into the core of Australia's budget system.
Because we are a non-partisan outfit, I'd like to point out that we've taken a leaf out of treasurers of the past. We're both smoking large cigars like Joe Hockey did when he released his first budget.
Very large celebratory cigars, yes.
So, submarine-shaped cigars. So, first of all, the headline. The budget says, I think, well, when you add up the figures, the government is going to be spending about $765 billion on defence over the decade.
We're starting to talk real money.
People have focused on $330 billion in the investment program, but the taxpayers are actually putting $765 billion into defence over this next 10 years. And my assessment is Australia's military power is not growing over that period. It allegedly starts to grow sometime from the mid-2030s on.
Well, if we look at the numbers, there's obviously, you can't have capability without dollars, but let's focus on the dollars rather than the capability right now. Yeah, so by the end of the decade, the Australian defence budget hits triple figures. It hits $100 billion.
And when you say end of the decade, you mean
the financial decade, the 10 years starting
so 2034.
Yes, it hits $100 billion. So we are certainly talking real money. But I think one of the key points to make is that growth sort of starts slowly and ramps up.
Well, but that's not true, because I heard the Deputy Prime Minister, who I think also is still the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, say that the increase in the defence budget over this next 4 years, the forward estimates of $5.7 billion, is an historic increase of profound proportions.
There's politics and there's numbers, so I'll just read the data here. So we saw in the integrated investment program that came out a few weeks ago, when we unpacked that a bit in our last episode, there is $50.3 billion of, quote, new money over the decade, but only 5.7 of that, so slightly more than 10%, is in the forward estimate.
Well,
so
the next 4 years. $5.7 billion starting right now over the next 4 years. Are you going to tell me it's not starting right now?
Well, okay. So that 5.7 billion. Now the one thing I will say is, when we're talking about the 5.7 and the 50.3, that is growth on top of growth. Okay, so the previous government had a 10-year line of numbers that came out in the 2016 white paper, and then it extended that line of numbers for another 4 years in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update.
And that was a fixed set of numbers, wasn't it? It wasn't dependent on GDP.
No, it wasn't related to GDP. It was a line of numbers in black and white, and by and large, governments since then have delivered those numbers. But we're sort of still in that 10-year period. So these additional numbers are on top of that. So the good news is it's growth on top of the growth that was already built into that set of numbers. But the additional growth, that 5.7, well, there's a couple of things we should note about that. The first thing is when we look at this year's budget, $3.8 billion of that is in the last year of the forward estimates. So there's only sort of 1.9 in the next 3 years. So that is essentially a rounding error.
So we hear from Richard Marles that there's $50 billion of new money in the 10 years, but because our circumstances are deteriorating so rapidly, he's got $5.7 billion in the forward estimates the first 4 years. But it turns out even the 5.7 is backloaded.
Correct.
And over a 3-year period, which is actually an electoral cycle, there's almost no new money, besides what was already in the glide path that started with the 2016 defence white paper.
So when I look at it, I go, well, over the next 3 years, we've essentially still got the same funding line that came out of the 2016 white paper 10 years ago. So despite reviews and updates saying our strategic circumstances are the worst they've been since World War II, we haven't actually really increased the funding line to take account of that. It's like you were going into World War II with a funding line developed in 1929 and you hadn't paid any attention over the intervening 10 years.
Well, it's actually a bit worse, isn't it? Because you have paid attention. There have been solid government statements now for over 4 years about how our security environment continues to deteriorate. But the funding line is the same as it was back in 2016 until 3 more years from now.
Yep.
So 3 more years from now is 2027. So that's 11 years, during which period phenomenal changes happen. In fact, so much change has happened that Australia now, in a historic change, says we need nuclear submarines to deter conflict.
Well, I mean, the other way of looking at it, I'm not sure, Mr. Marles would agree with this, is that if the previous government got the number right for 2026 back in 2016, they were remarkably prescient, but I'm not sure he would agree with that assessment.
And now another thing, so if we say, all right, the 5.7 billion in this next 4 years, unfortunately, is mainly in the fourth of these next 4 years, over the rest of the decade, how much money is available for anything new or different other than general purpose frigates or nuclear submarines?
Of that 50.3, 1 billion. So when we break down the 5.7,
that's 2%,
and the 50.3, it is all for the submarine gap. So the gap between cancelled attack class program and the much greater cost of the new SSN program. So over the decade, about 38 billion is for the submarine gap. Around about 11 billion is for the recently announced general purpose frigate program, and 1 billion is for other stuff, which apparently is to sort of accelerate things like missiles and autonomous systems.
Right.
So that's it.
1% of the new money is for anything that isn't a nuclear submarine or a general purpose frigate.
2%. Yes.
2%.
Yep.
That's not a lot, is it, given the changing nature of war?
Yes, and what I would also note, and we spoke about this in the last episode, is that we now have this very, charitably call it focused investment. Others might call it unbalanced investment, where 38% of the investment program is going on maritime capabilities, but the bulk of them aren't actually going to be even start to be delivered until right at the end of the decade. So all that new submarine money doesn't actually give us a submarine until right at the end of the decade. The next biggest project, of course, is the Hunter-class frigates. Again, we don't get the first frigate until the end of the decade.
Let's just pop the balloon but there will be a nuclear submarine commanded by an Australian in 2032 or 2033, and there will be a Hunter frigate in, when is it now, 2034, 2035. Getting one of something does not give you a reliable capability. In fact, in the happy land of nuclear submarines, you need to have 4 to have one reliably available. So this idea that in the 10-year period we'll have a nuclear submarine and maybe a Hunter frigate, therefore we've got a capability, we don't. You do not get a useful capability in the submarine world until the 2040s, if all goes well, because that's when the 4th Australian commanded submarine turns up. So this is why my assessment is Australia's military is getting weaker over this next 10 years, not stronger. And even beyond that 10-year period, it takes another almost 10 years to have appreciable growing power in the maritime world, where 38% of capital investment is going.
Yeah, well, I think in the maritime space, we are seeing what a slow motion train wreck looks like. So we've made so many bad decisions or deferred decisions since the 2009 white paper. Time has finally caught up with us, and we are retiring the Anzac class well before they're replaced by new frigates, and so the number of service combatants is going down, and I reckon we will have the lowest number of major service combatants we've had since World War II.
Well, we'll get onto it shortly, but I think there's perhaps even worse news in the undersea world coming. But before we get there, we spoke in the last podcast about the capability program, the investment program. One big thing coming out of this budget, I think, is the continuing workforce crisis, the continued collapse in military numbers, and Defence's unwillingness to admit that its aspirational plans to get the people it needs to operate the capabilities it's buying are failing. And if you don't get the people you need, it doesn't even matter if the stuff turns up on time, because you can't operate.
Yes, well, there's no good news around people in the budget. So even since the portfolio additional estimates, which came out a few months ago, we've gone down another 200 in the ADF numbers since then. So when, again, we go back to the 2016 white paper that theoretically put the ADF on a growth trajectory, the ADF has grown in those 8 years by a sum total of about 170 people. So it's grown by 20 a year.
It's meant to have grown on average by 1,000 people a year. It's a little bit like what you were saying about the Navy, its actual platforms, that the problems of the last decade now are compounding into the future. So if you haven't got the workforce growth you're meant to have got in the last 8 years, and you still say you need all those people, you've got to play an enormous game of catch-up before you're back on the growth curve you say you need. And Defence is not showing any sign that it can fill the hole in its workforce from its failed previous years. So don't they need to have grown by 5,500 uniformed personnel in this next financial year to then be on track?
Yeah, so by a major miracle they can do that. Yeah, they need another 5,500 people.
The challenge in 1 year when their average growth has been about 20.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge for Defence is when you have a separation rate of 8 to 10% a year, which translates into, sort of 5 to 6,000, you need to find 5 to 6,000 new people every year just to tread water.
To stay still. Yeah,
and they're having difficulty doing that. But the other thing I will say around people is even though the ADF is not growing in real terms, Defence's people costs are growing fairly rapidly in real terms. So the cost of their people is increasing much faster than inflation. So even though their numbers are staying still, their people costs are going up in real terms. And
so the per capita cost is going up, and it's going up enough that while the actual workforce falls, the bill for the personnel is going up. So they're paying more for fewer people.
Well, they did increase their APS, their public service people, by about 1,000 last year. So I mean, it's easier to find public servants.
Well, particularly if they're losing jobs at consultancy.
But the thing I'll note is that Defence kind of keeps getting its numbers wrong. So I look at the numbers in this year's budget. To me, that we have now cumulatively missed Defence's acquisition spend since the white paper by $25 billion.
Which is a bigger amount than in the Treasurer's Future Made in Australia budget, which is being roundly criticised for being exorbitantly expensive. And so the failure in defence acquisition is bigger.
But that money isn't sort of being handed back into consolidated revenue. That's sort of being balanced by overspends in both sustainment and people. Yeah. So Defence keeps getting its predictions wrong there. So, for example, just in 23-24, the financial year that's ending, Defence got its people cost wrong by $900 million. So it's come in $900 million more than it was planning.
But it's had less military than it planned.
Yeah.
So the worst thing is if Defence's targets got met, because if it spent the amount of money it aspires to spend on acquisition, 42% of the total budget, that would be a huge amount of cash. But if it actually achieved its personnel figure,
that could could be rather terrifying for its budget implications.
Well, the Treasurer would have to recalculate the deficit that he was willing to live with because of Defence meeting its plans. But as you mentioned in our last podcast about Defence's aspirational plan to lift the acquisition share of the budget to 42%, having failed since the 2016 white paper to get it anything but marginally over 30%, this fact that they have unrealisable plans is now probably baked in to Treasury thinking.
It may well be. Treasury tends to be fairly realistic about this. So, but, that growth trajectory to 42%, this land that they're never going to get to, again, that starts now. So by the back end of the forward estimates, they're meant to be at around 35%.
But if they manage to solve their recruitment and retention crisis, then their people costs
would go up, so their acquisition spend would go down.
So you can't get to 42%.
That's why you're never going to get to 42%.
Anyway, on personnel, these numbers matter an awful lot, and I think we can see that in the world of submarines, because you put a shout out to the world, as it turns out, on what are the crew numbers needed for the Virginia-class submarines, and you got answered. You actually got answered by a US official, a guy called Dan Packer, the Director of Naval Submarine Forces for AUKUS. He's publicly provided information that the Australian Defence Department, the Submarine Agency, and ministers have told us they can't provide, won't provide, don't have.
Well, as they say, ask and you shall receive. And so, yes, in the last episode, we sort of mentioned that the Australian government had steadfastly refused to say how many uniformed submariners would need for the SSN force. But in an interview published in the US Naval Institute News, this gentleman, Dan Packer, has given us a number, and that number is 3,000. And he also says, well, Australia's at 800 at the moment. So essentially, we need to quadruple the number of submariners
so for
we have.
6 Collins-class submarines, there are 800. But for 8 AUKUS submarines, starting with the US Virginias, you need 3,000. Right. Okay. So you need to quadruple.
Yeah. So the question, of course, is how we going to get there. And I don't know if he's a Navy officer, it doesn't say here. Let's call him Mr. Packer. So Mr. Packer has a plan to get there. So he is going to, quote, ingest, interesting term, around 100.
You mean ingest as in take in, not in a comedic fashion?
He will take in 104 Australians starting this year to train as nuclear submariners, and that number is going to grow every year.
Okay, well, one thing that immediately pops out to me there is if 100 Australian Navy soldiers and officers are going into the US nuclear submarine training program, what input is there still into the Collins training pipeline to keep operating the 6 Collins submarines into the early 2040s?
That is a very good question. So I don't know how many Collins submariners we produce a year, but you sort of go, well, we probably have a separation rate of 8 to 10%. And so if there's 750 to 800 submariners, you probably are doing 60 to 80 submariners a year
so you need to
at the moment.
Presumably keep doing that while you're still operating Collins and find 100 extra. But I remember the awful trouble in getting enough Collins crew out of the Australian population. So I just wonder how you're going to keep getting about 60 Collins new crew into a pipeline and then magically get 104 at the start to go into the Virginia pipeline and grow that. Like the mathematics to me doesn't look like it's going to work.
The only way it's going to work is if we get a lot more people being interested in submariners. Now, I think we all have different views around the likelihood of that, but what this says to me is that we are very quickly going to start cannibalizing Collins submariners.
Well, one obvious thing is if someone's looking at becoming a submariner and they get a choice between are you going to join the new nuclear submarine force, which is getting brand new super capable submarines, or are you going to go to those clapped out old groovers called the Collins and husband them into their ship graveyard? I think the incentives to go into the nuclear program far outweigh those to just keep Collins somehow bubbling along.
And it's the same if you work in industry. Why, if you're a bright young apprentice who wants to work on submarines, would you decide to work on Collins? Let's
say that the mathematics won't work. You won't get 50 or 60 new Australian Navy people into the Collins pipeline while you get 104 growing every year into the US submarine training pipeline. The problem there is you can't keep operating the Collins over a lengthy transition. You start to have to do what we've talked about with the surface fleet. You start to have to, instead of updating the Anzacs, you start retiring them much earlier than planned.
Yeah, look, I think we are very soon going to be in a similar situation with our submarine fleet as we are with our surface fleet, where we are retiring Anzacs well before they are replaced because they're so clapped out it's not worth putting the money into upgrading them, and we don't have the crews.
And in the case of the Collins, it'll be, look, the hull is still in good order because they haven't actually done too much diving because of their low availability early on, but all of the systems inside, from the propulsion to the periscope to the sonar to the combat system, all of that needs to be replaced, and the complexity and cost of doing that is eye-watering. And then the Navy will say, but even if you did all 6, we couldn't crew them because we're cannibalizing the crew pipeline for Virginia. You end up retiring lots of Collins early, not one for one with the Virginias. In fact, I think your calculation is that it'll be 3 Collins for every 1 Virginia.
Well, so there's there's 56 crew on a Collins roughly. There's 130-ish on a Virginia. So there's about 2.5 Collins crews per Virginia. We currently have 5 Collins crews. So the first 2 Virginias are the equivalent of the entire Collins fleet at the moment. So if every Collins boat went through a life of type extension, theoretically, the last one could serve until 2048. My own view is I can't see the Collins getting out of the 2030s, and I think the last Collins could go well before then, because you're just, not going to have the people, and you're not going to have the industrial capacity as you start managing the Virginia fleet and building the AUKUS fleet. So I think sometime, maybe around about the time we get the 2nd or 3rd Virginia, I think it's all over for Collins. It's just going to be withdrawn from service because we just won't have either the uniformed or the industrial workforce to go.
If the mathematics is right, the Collins doesn't do a graceful long transition. In fact, we start withdrawing Collins much faster than planned, and before the Virginias have built to a reliable capability of 4 boats. And in the 2030s, Australia actually has a much weaker submarine capability, arguably, than even now. And this is part of my overall judgment that Australia's military is getting weaker over this next 10, and in this case 15 years, under the government's plan, not stronger. But Dan Packer told us something else very interesting, which was about how many Australians are going to be serving on how many American attack boats.
So if we're cranking out, starting this year, 100 Australian nuclear qualified submariners a year, and that's going to grow every year. But
they don't come home and act as security
guards. What are we
guards.
doing with them for the next decade until we get the first boat? So they've got to go somewhere to actually serve on nuclear submarines. Well, so the US Navy is very kindly providing them with a home.
Well, I don't want to verbal any official, and I know this is super classified stuff because no Australian official or minister can tell us it.
Super classified.
So I'll just read from this
US Naval
public
Institute
set of
news.
statements in the Naval Institute News in America from Mr. Packer. At some point, he said, the US Navy will have 440 Australians on 25 attack submarines, with each crew including 2 or 3 Australian officers, 7 nuclear enlisted and 9 non-nuclear enlisted sailors. This is something that has never happened before, he said. We are completely 100% integrating them into our crew from a complete and utter perspective.
So this is quite interesting because, well, first of all, 25 SSNs is over half the US fleet.
Ooh.
Okay, it's more about all of their deployable fleet, and they're going to be fully integrated, and so
completely and utterly.
Yeah, completely and utterly, and so they're going to be making up, 15% of the crew of each of those boats. So it's very hard to see those US boats making up half of their fleet actually doing anything without those Australians, which kind of brings to mind that question that has been coming up of people going, but if we get AUKUS boats, if we get Virginias, does that oblige us to support the US in a potential future conflict
wherever they want these submarines used?
With China.
Yep.
And our government has been very resolute in saying, no, there is no obligation.
It's sovereign. Australian commanders, Australian boats, Australian decisions.
So in a sense, the government's been saying, well, when we don't have to go to war with the US against China just because we have nuclear-powered submarines. But when I look at this and go, there's going to be 400 Australian submariners on 25 US boats, we're going to war.
Well, before the first Australian commanded submarine turns up. So it is not conceivable that if there was a conflict and the American president wanted to use the US Navy's attack submarines,
which everybody says is its primary frontline asset.
That's why we're getting them. They're such a powerful weapon. That an Australian government could say, well, that's interesting, President Trump or President Hunter Biden. You can't do that until I get all my Australian crew off your boats, because if they're completely and utterly integrated, which is something that has never happened before, the US can't backfill them. And it's too big a number. 13 to 15% of your crews across 25 attack submarines are all Australian. You can't operate your fleet without the Australians there. there. So before there's the first Australian command at Virginia, this is an absolute joint capability.
It is a thoroughly integrated capability. And so all this stuff about, we don't necessarily have to go to war. Our Australian-owned submarines might not be going to war, but 440 Australians on the US boats are.
With each crew including 2 or 3 Australian officers, 7 nuclear enlisted and 9 non-nuclear enlisted sailors. Yes. So this is another case where the Australian public finding out key information about the AUKUS program relies on American transparency and openness in the face of Australian official and ministerial obfuscation and refusal to provide information. So thank you, Dan Packer from the US Naval Submarine Force, for telling us some simple truths that are essential to our understanding of this most expensive, most complex and largest program in Australian defence history.
And just on that, the largeness of this program, we knew already it was huge, the 268 to 368 billion over the next 30 years. We got from the new IIP a figure over the decade, I believe 53 to 63 billion, which gets us just to the handover of the first boat. But now from the portfolio budget statements that came out a couple of days ago, we've got a figure for the forward estimates. And already, just over the forward estimates, it's $13.5 billion for the submarine program.
So we do not have to wait to see that the submarine program is already distorting the entire Australian Defence Force. It's happening in this next 4 years, not even just the next 10.
Correct.
Right. Well, thank you, Marcus. And I think it shows the incredible power of your voice on this podcast that you asked for a number around the nuclear submarine crewing equation for AUKUS, and an American official delivered.
Apparently I have influence.
But I hope for more transparency from our American allies on this program, because I see no sign we're going to get that from our government.
I don't think
or
we're going to
Defence
get it
Department.
from our own side, no.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you, Michael.